This week, in Torah portion and more, we find 63 of the 613 commandments in a Torah. That's a lot. Here, let's do the math. There are 54 Torah portions spread out over the course of each year. If we got 63 commandments in every portion, that would mean we would end up with 3,402 commandments. I'm not sure if that would be a blessing or a curse. But I'd like to say that 613 thou shalts and thou shalt nots seem to have kept us busy enough for the past 3,500 years, so I think that's good. But what's more remarkable than the sheer number of commandments in Parshat Emor is how many of these commandments direct us on how to sanctify time in our lives. Most of the laws of Emor teach us and deal with the observance of the Shabbat and the holidays. These are practical commandments. There's a recipe for challah and how to display it on the table for each Shabbat. We learn about the timing of the Jewish calendar, when to eat matzah, when to blow the shofar, and when to observe the other annual rites and rituals. But hidden within these carefully detailed commandments for celebrating sacred time, we find one verse which is seemingly strangely out of place. Here, out of nowhere, we read of the famous commandments, one of the most famous commandments in the Torah, the commandment about leaving the corners of our fields for the poor, which forms the root of the laws of tzedakah here in the Torah. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of the field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am Adonai, your God. Why is this injunction to feed the poor found here in Emor, scattered among the detailed rules for celebrating Sabbath and the festivals? Well, the rabbis teach us that the placement of this verse offers us a critical insight into the true meaning of holiness. The Hebrew word for holiness, kedushah, literally means to set aside, to set apart in some way, which is different. Here the Torah teaches us that the obligation to create sacred space and sacred time are woven together. We sanctify our time by setting aside our daily deeds as we celebrate Shabbat and the holy days that make them holy. We sanctify space by setting aside the corners of our fields, a portion of our harvest or income for the hungry and for the poor. Emor is the commandment-filled portion of the book of Leviticus, the central book of the Torah. Following immediately after the Holiness Code, chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, where we read, "You shall be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy." The great spiritual lesson of Leviticus, we now receive the more practical guide for bringing holiness into our lives. Holiness is to be found, we are taught in Emor, by setting apart and honoring sacred time and sacred space. The essential question of Leviticus is simply this: how can we be holy? And the answer which Leviticus teaches here in Emor and throughout the book is that holiness can be found through the separation of sacred and profane. Sabbaths and holidays are meant to serve as markers scattered weekly and more widely throughout the year, and Emor teaches us that the lessons beneath these sacred moments are as important just as well. On Shabbat, we're commanded to rest from all our labors, not just we alone, but our entire household, our workers, our animals, and the strangers who live among us. All are to be afforded the blessings of Shabbat. Matzah on Passover, the poor bread, a reminder that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, refugees on the perilous journey to our promised land. A reminder in each bite we take that once we were slaves and now we are free. But until all of us find freedom, none of us are truly free. The sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, our call to righteousness, waking us up out of our doldrums to our ability to change, to be the person that we have within us to be, marking each new year as sacred time, setting it apart to lend order and purpose to our lives. And the great fast of Yom Kippur, a reminder that the true fast is one that reminds us that we are kin to the homeless and the hungry, who fast not for one day each year, but for many. So here, amidst the laws of Sabbath and holidays, it makes perfect sense that we're called to set aside the corners of our fields for the poor, to set aside our portion of the harvest, to remember the needs of the hungry and the poor. The Torah teaches us that sacred space and sacred time are meant to be joined. Just as each holiday has its call for social justice, just as each justice and righteous act carries within it a response to the higher spiritual call, an opportunity for tikkun olam, an opportunity to become partners with God and to heal the brokenness of our world. Perhaps the greatest example of this value of binding sacred space with sacred time came in 1965, amidst the social revolution of the civil rights movement. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel returned from marching with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. And when his students at the seminary asked him about being part of such a sacred moment in time, he said, "I felt as if my feet were praying." Reaching for holiness means setting aside the step-by-step patterns of our everyday lives in order to step forth towards a new and a better world. Setting aside sacred time like Shabbat each week, just as you have set this time aside to join in this service on this Shabbat morning. And herein lies this lesson for today. In the endless doldrums of our setting ourselves aside, creating the space for social distance to save lives and stem the tide of this deadly virus, we too are presented with a sacred opportunity for setting this time aside as special and unique. A time for connecting with family and with friends, caring for one another, picking up our heads to the distance we have traveled, and setting sights on the way ahead. The essential question of Leviticus is, how can we be holy? And the essential answer we can learn is that holiness can be found through the separation between sacred and profane. Separating ourselves from infection and disease means creating holiness in space. The question which remains is, how can we make this physical separation an opportunity for holiness in time? The memories of these days and the challenges we have faced within them will remain etched within our hearts and our minds, long after the need for this separation will have gone. How we set apart this time of separation, how we can bridge the distance across space which separates us from one another, this we can choose. And this is our opportunity to bring holiness into our lives and healing for the brokenness of our world. The choices we make and the deeds that we have done, these frame the legacies of our lives. May this time be a time of healing and of hope. May this time be a time of repair and renewal. May this time be a time of holiness for us all, as together we commit ourselves towards the building of a better world. Shabbat Shalom.